That, I think, leaves us in the best position to reach the kind of agreement, compromise, solution that can put us on the right path, because everybody's going to have to swallow a little bit. I thank the chair. I'm going to yield the floor.
Thank you. Senator from Iowa.
Well, Madam President, I couldn't help but listen to the words of my friend from Alabama regarding the debt and the deficit, and then to be reminded that we did balance the budget not too long ago. In fact, in 1993, we passed a tax bill here in the Senate and in the House. It was signed into law by President Clinton, which set us on a course to reduce the deficit. In fact, by the year 1999 and 2000, we balanced the budget. We had a surplus. Can you imagine that, Madam President? We had a surplus for 3 years in a row. The Congressional Budget Office and OMB said that if we had continued on the pathway that we were on, we would have fully paid off the national debt by 2010. So when I hear my friends on the Republican side talk about reducing the deficit and the debt, we did that when the Democrats were in charge of the Senate and the House, and we had the presidency. I would also point out that not one Republican on that side of the aisle voted for that bill in 1993. I can remember standing here and debating with my friend from Texas at that time on this bill, and they were all kinds of dire warnings that if this bill passed, we were going to have depressions, recessions, the business community would stop. It would be the worst thing that ever happened to this country if we passed the Clinton tax proposal. Well, we passed it, but without one Republican vote. And what happened? We had the largest spurt of economic growth that this country had seen almost since the 1950s, 60s. To the point where, as I said, by the end of the 1990s, we had a balanced budget and we had a surplus. Well then, President Bush comes into office. We had surpluses, enough to retire the entire national debt by the year 2010. So what President Bush said, well, he said, now we're going to give tax cuts. And they pushed through this big tax cut bill, which this senator did not vote for. And that tax cut bill, which gave a lot away to corporations and to the wealthy in our country so that they didn't have to pay their fair share, that plus 2 wars that we didn't pay for, plus a recession, and now we're in this huge deficit. So we know how to get ourselves out of this fix. We did it in 1993, and it was by having the people of this country pay their fair share of taxes, to make sure that corporations, to make sure that those who enjoy the benefits of living in this free and productive society pay their fair share, for all of us to raise the revenues necessary to meet our obligations in education and health, infrastructure building, the security of our nation, and also to raise enough revenues so that we can reduce the deficit. But it can only be done by all. And that's what President Obama has spoken about. He spoke about that in his inaugural address. That's what we have been talking about here for a long time. And that is shared sacrifice on behalf of all, and to make sure that all pay their fair share of taxes in this country so that we can once again do what we did in 1993. We can do it again if only my friends on the Republican side will join with us in making sure we raise the necessary revenues to get us out of this hole that we're in. Madam President, with that, I yield the floor.
Senator from Missouri.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the period of morning business be extended until 2 p.m. today and that all provisions of the previous order remain in effect.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from, the senator from Missouri.
Madam President, I am, first of all, this is the first time I've spoken on the floor when you were in the chair, and so welcome to the Senate and welcome to the presiding chair. I want to talk for a few minutes today about a baseball great, a Missouri great, Stan Musial, who passed away on Saturday at the age of 92. Stan Musial was born in November of 1920 in Donora, Pennsylvania. His title was Stan the Man. He was the youngest of 6 children when he wasn't called Stan the Man. He was just a guy who worked for who worked at a company when he was a young man, whose dad was a Polish immigrant, whose mother was of Czechoslovakian ancestry, whose dreams were probably not to become a professional baseball player, but who was a great athlete from the very start. In his remarks when he presented Stan Musial the Medal of Freedom in 2011, President Obama said that, quoting President Obama, Stan matched his hustle with humility. He retired with 17 records, even as he missed a season in his prime to serve his country in the Navy. He was the first player to make, and again, I'm still quoting President Obama, he was the first person to make, get this, $100,000, even playing baseball. Even more shocking, according to the President, Stan Musial, he asked for a pay cut when he didn't perform up to his own expectations. That ends the pay quote. I don't think that August Bush gave him a pay cut. That ends the quote. I don't think August Bush gave him the pay cut, but I have read the story where Stan Musial was holding out for a pay package somewhere in the mid-90s, and August Bush, Jr., who not long before that had bought the Cardinals, called him into the office and said, I'm never going to pay you $90,000 he was asking for. He said, I'm going to pay you $100,000, and you're going to be the first baseball player to make $100,000. Stan Musial played for the Cardinals from 1941 to 1963, the only major league team he played for. He entered the majors in 1941 as the 5th youngest player. He ended his career in 1963 as the 3rd oldest player. He had a record of 24 times being named to the Major League Baseball All-Star team. He won 7 National League batting titles, 3 National League Most Valuable Player awards, and he led the Cardinals to 3 World Series championships in the 1940s. Stan Musial, number 6, had batted at least 300 in every one of his 17 seasons. The 300 hitter for every one of his 17 seasons. His lifetime batting average was 331. He batted 330 in the year before he decided to retire. He had 3,630 career hits. He hit 1,815 hits in St. Louis at Sportsman's Park and Busch Stadium, and he hit another 1,815 on the road. He played as well at home as he did away from home. He missed the entire 1945 season while he was serving in the Navy. It was a fan at Ebbets Field, the Dodgers playing at Ebbets Field, who groaned as he came to the plate one time in a game where he was always particularly good against the Dodgers. He said, "Here comes the man," and from that point on, his nickname was Stan the Man. I had a chance to sit by Tommy Lasorda one day at lunch a few years ago after I'd read a biography of Stan Musial, and Tommy Lasorda, the longtime Dodgers manager who was a player when Stan Musial was playing, said he thought Stan Musial was the best ball player he ever saw play and was death on the Dodgers. He was the Dodgers liked him, the Dodgers fans liked him, but it was a real rivalry. Stan Musial was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame the first year he was eligible in 1969. He would be one of the great ambassadors for baseball for the rest of his life. When he retired in 1963, Commissioner Ford Frick says, "Here stands baseball's perfect warrior. Here stands baseball's perfect knight." He became an American icon throughout ballparks and over the radio in 1940s and 1950s, KMOX in St. Louis had this booming signal that went all the way to almost all the way to the West Coast. It covered a lot of the South. St. Louis, the Cardinals, were the furthest south of any baseball team and the furthest west of any baseball team, and because of that, Stan Musial played on a club that in many ways became America's team at that time. I can remember growing up in southwest Missouri on a dairy farm, particularly late at night when we were hauling hay, and I can remember this when I was 10 or 12 years old. Whoever was in the truck must have almost been deaf, because we'd have the driver would have the radio turned up as loud as you could turn the radio up, and the St. Louis Cardinal game would be coming out of both windows as we were out there working in the field, or if we weren't working in the field, sitting on a porch somewhere listening to the Cardinals play. And there was no greater Cardinal than Stan Musial. Bob Gibson, another great Cardinal and Stan's teammate and a fellow Hall of Famer, said, "Stan Musial is the nicest man I ever met in baseball." Bob Gibson went on to say he didn't particularly associate nice with baseball, but he associated nice with Stan Musial. Bob Costas had this to say about Stan Musial. He said, "Stan Musial didn't hit in 56 straight games. He didn't hit 400 for a season. He didn't get 4,000 hits. He didn't hit 500 home runs. He didn't hit a home run his last time at bat. He just hit a single the last time he was at bat. He didn't marry Marilyn Monroe. He married his high school sweetheart. His excellence was a quiet excellence." ESPN recently titled Musial the most underrated athlete ever. Only Hank Aaron, to think about the things that Stan Musial didn't do, only Hank Aaron had more runs than Stan Musial and extra base hits. Only Tris Speaker and Pete Rose had more hits. Only Babe Ruth and Barry Bonds created more runs, but Stan Musial was at the highest levels in all of those areas. Writing in the Post-Dispatch this week, Bernie Misclox wrote, "Let's celebrate Musial's extraordinary life and be thankful for his enduring presence through the decades. Let's keep it simple in honor of this remarkably uncomplicated man. There's never been a more perfect union, a better relationship between an athlete and a town than Stan Musial and St. Louis. From the time Stan took his first at-bat as a Cardinal until his death Saturday at his home in Ladue, he was part of the community's soul for 71 years, 4 months, and 2 days. Many stories about Stan Musial have been told. I want to mention 3 that Bernie mentioned in that same article. Talked about when Musial was first inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, as I said earlier, as soon as you could possibly be inducted. It was an overcast day in Cooperstown. The crowd was quiet, subdued, a little bit put off by the day. Moments before Musial's official ceremony, the clouds got out of the way, the sunshine emerged, and Dizzy Dean's widow, Pat Dean, said, "Stan brought the sun. He always does." In the 1960s, a second story, Musial and other major league stars visited U.S. troops in Vietnam and went to the military hospital to console the wounded. One seriously injured soldier looked up at Musial from his hospital bed and said, "You're the best." Musial's response was, "No, you are." Brooklyn Dodgers pitcher Joe Black, an African-American, told a story about being racially taunted by players in the St. Louis dugout during a game. Musial, who was batting at the time, facing Joe Black, stepped out and angrily kicked the dirt to convey his disapproval of his own teammates, and he waited after the game to tell Black, "I'm sorry that happened, but you don't have to worry about it. You're a great pitcher. You'll win a lot of games." Black said Musial's support helped him gain the confidence he needed to become a top pitcher. And the fourth and last story that Bernie told was when legendary center fielder Willie Mays frequently talked about Musial coming and befriending African-American players during the All-Star game. They were being ignored by everybody else. According to Mays, this is a Mays quote, "We were in the back of the clubhouse playing poker, and none of the white guys had come back or said hi or how's it going or how are you guys doing or welcome to the All-Star game. We were playing poker, and all of a sudden I look up, and here comes Stan toward us. He grabs a chair, sits down, and starts playing cards with us. And Stan didn't know how to play poker." According to Willie Mays, Stan didn't know how to play poker, but his way of welcoming us to the game, making us feel better, I never forgot it, and we never forgot it. Mutual didn't make a lot of fiery speeches. He didn't lead a movement. He didn't try to promote himself as an angelic humanitarian. He just did good things. And then there's a last story, the love story between Stan and his wife, Lil. Maybe the best mutual statistic of all. They were married for 71 years, 4 months, and 2 days until Lil died on May the 3rd. Stan followed her in January. KMOX, the hay truck I talked about, like lots of other Cardinal fans and Mutual fans, I remember the first time I saw Stan Musial play at Sportsman's Park. I remember the first time 30 years later I actually met him when I was the Secretary of State in Missouri, and getting to meet Stan Musial was about as good as it got even then. I remember hearing him play Take Me Out to the Ball Game on his harmonica. Baseball was lucky to have him. Missouri was lucky to have him. The Cardinals in St. Louis were lucky to have him. And I'm pleased to be here today to say how much we appreciate Stan Musial, and I'm also pleased to be joined by my colleague from Missouri, Senator McCaskill.
Madam President.
Senator from Missouri.
Well, I want to thank my colleague. He and I agree on many things. We disagree on many things, but we agree on many things. And usually those begin and end with the state we love, Missouri, and certainly some of our most famous and beloved people that come from Missouri, and obviously there is no one that deserves more love and respect than Stan Musial. There are so many memories about Stan Musial that I want to try to encapsulate today. But the interesting thing about the memories I have about Stan Musial is that I don't have these memories because I'm a United States Senator. They don't belong uniquely to me because I'm an elected official. I have these memories that I share with hundreds of thousands of people that were lucky enough to encounter Stan Musial during his time on Earth. You know, Stan Musial was never, you know when you meet somebody and you can tell they're kind of looking over you to try to find the person who's more important behind you? Or maybe they're impatient because they don't think that you're a big enough deal to be taking their time. And if you look at our sports icons today that travel with a posse and that have an entourage and that have certain rules about who can come near them and who can't and when, that was not Stan Musial. Not one day of his career or one day after his career did he consider himself untouchable. He saw it as his duty and obligation to be there for all fans, whether it was somebody who worked at the ballpark sweeping after the game was over, or whether it was a very talented ball player from another team. Everyone was equal in Stan Musial's eyes. What a wonderful American value. And I could stand here today and talk about his amazing record as a baseball player, his unique swing, the beauty of his accomplishments in America's favorite pastime. But what we really need to focus on as we mourn the loss of this living legend is his character. Because it was his character that brought universal love, respect, and devotion to the man, our man, Stan the Man. I know that Senator Blunt talked about this story, but I want to elaborate on this story a little bit. It's 1952. Joe Black has just been called up after spending 1 year in the minors with the Brooklyn organization. He's been called up to the majors. He is facing Stan Musial. Now, keep in mind, this is an accomplished baseball player who had won 2 championships in the Negro Baseball Leagues. And it had only been a few years since Jackie Robinson had, in fact, broken the barrier, the color barrier for Major League Baseball. He is facing Stan Musial, who already was the most feared hitter in baseball. He's standing there as a black man on the mound in this baseball game, and out of the Cardinal dugout come jeers and taunts. In fact, one of the things that was said was, "Hey, Stan, you're not going to have any trouble hitting the ball against that dark background." Stan Musial, when the game was over, he decided not to stay in the Cardinal dugout. And Joe Black told the story that as he sat in the dugout, he felt a hand on his shoulder. And he looked up, and here was Stan Musial in the opposing dugout saying to Joe Black, "You're going to be a great pitcher." Now, that encapsulates the character of Stan Musial. Chuck Connors, the rifleman, used to tell the story. He was a struggling hitter and for the Chicago Cubs. And I may need to explain to you, Madam President, but I certainly don't need to explain to anybody in Cardinal Nation that the Chicago Cubs are an opponent. We don't like the Chicago Cubs in Cardinal Nation. So he asked a teammate, Chuck Connors, what he should do about his swing. He was struggling with being able to hit in the majors. And they all told him the same thing. The only guy who can help you is Stan Musial. So even though he was reluctant to approach a hitter on the opposing team, he went to Musial and asked for help. And of course, Stan responded as all of us would expect he would. He spent 30 minutes in the cage with an opposing player trying to help him with his swing. And Connors recanted that, you know, he really wasn't ever that good of a hitter, but he said he never forgot Stan Musial's kindness. And when he finished watching me cut away at the ball, Stan slapped me on the back and told me just to keep swinging. After the 1946 season, the promoters from the Mexican League decided it was time for them to up the ante on baseball. Now, at the time, Stan Musial was making the enormous sum of $13,500 for playing for the St. Louis Cardinals. Now, the Mexican League came to Stan Musial and said, "We're going to offer you a king's ransom," at the time, $125,000 for 5 years. That was a lot of money for Stan Musial and his family. But he turned down the Mexican League. He said at the time, he said later when asked about it, "Back in my day, we didn't think about money as much. We just enjoyed playing the game. We loved baseball. I didn't think about anybody else but the Cardinals." Harry Carey knew Stan Musial for over 50 years. He would often tell the story of Stan Musial wandering out of the ballpark after a steaming doubleheader. And trust me, we can have steaming doubleheaders in Missouri. Looking like he'd been through 15 rounds in a prize fight, and every single thing in his body language signifying that he was exhausted and just wanted to go home and lie down. Instead, when he got to his car, he found fans waiting for him. "Watch this," Harry Carey told a friend, and sure enough, Musial's whole body straightened like Popeye had just eaten a can of spinach, and he started shouting, "What do you say? What do you say?" and signed every single autograph of all the fans surrounding his car. Harry Carey loved telling that story, not because it was unusual, that's who Stan Musial was, but for the opposite reason, because it was ordinary. Even in his time, when baseball players weren't paid as much and so were more part of the community, Stan Musial stood apart by standing with the people in the community. And you know, it wasn't just Cardinal Nation that worshipped Stan Musial. His opponents, the opposing teams. I mean, how many baseball players? Can you imagine today this happening? Believe it or not, the New York Mets had a Stan Musial Day at their park. And in Chicago, the home of the Cubs, he once finished first in a favorite player survey, edging out the legendary Ernie Banks, also a very nice guy who was beloved by the fans of baseball in the Midwest. I could go on and on with the stories that reflect this man's character. So yes, he has amazing statistics. Yes, him hitting a baseball was a thing of beauty that all of America is in awe of. But really what this man was about that phrase that we love to throw around in politics way too often, and that's American values. This was a man who didn't have to talk about his values because he lived them. His love for his family, how close they are. I am very fortunate to be friends with the Musial family and have visited with them in the days since his death. They got messages from every star in the constellation of American baseball. But one stood out, and I would close with this. Joe Torre, upon hearing of Stan's death just a few days ago, sent a message to the Musial family, and it said just simply this: Stan Musial was a Hall of Famer in the game of life. We will miss you, Stan Musial. I yield the floor. Madam President, I have 2 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They've been approved by the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
And I note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
The Senate's in a quorum call. The Senate does this while waiting for a senator to come to the floor to speak. They've been giving general speeches this morning while negotiations continue off the floor over changing Senate rules on the filibuster. While we wait for the senator to speak, we're going to take you to the House Armed Services Committee, which is investigating sexual misconduct allegations at Lackland Air Force Base, where the Air Force trains recruits.
In making the allegation of a forcible rape, because you only have one's word against the other, no other witnesses, so you got to prove the case, prove it by some physical evidence. A rape kit is what it's generally called. Why is it that we don't make provisions for these types of cases, which I think are pretty typical, in addition to the other sexual assault cases, harassment, non-physical activities? Why is it that we're not dealing with this issue of rape and forcible sodomy and things like that in terms of police investigation and prosecutorial ability to prosecute effectively?
Congressman, we are. We've trained 24 Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Special Victims Investigators to this point. We have just started a new class model on the Army's CID class that was advised by outside experts who put together a curriculum to focus on that type of investigation. That first class was just completed this week. We had some outside experts in to give us some feedback that was objective. We will run classes through that course routinely. We sent 50 Air Force Judge Advocate Generals and OSI agents through the Army CID course before starting this one. We will continue to further train our investigators in the skills required to better investigate these actions. My opinion is that part of the reason we have trouble with people sticking with an investigation and a prosecution, victims sticking with it, is because the way they are handling the investigative cycle is so critical to them being willing to stay with their commitment to actually identifying and prosecuting an assailant.
Gentleman, time expired. Ms. Walorski.
Thank you. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they would. Yeah.
I'm sitting up over there, and those guys, when they got them, oh, this guy over here.
I'm sorry, of those, 17% of those women reported the incident. And my question is, and I apologize, I'm brand new, and this is my first hearing. I don't have the benefit of all of our veterans in here who have been on the committee. If I'm a woman in the military and I'm sexually assaulted, how do I report that? Do I pick up a phone? Is there a 911 in the military? How do I report that? Do I call from my cell phone? What generates the report?
Any number of things. There are hotlines at every base in the military. You can tell someone in your chain of command. You can go. Everyone knows that you can go to the Inspector General. You can go to the security forces. You can go to the base hospital or clinic and ask for help there. Anywhere in that network is connected to the reporting mechanism that then starts the activity moving forward. The problem we have is not that most of our people don't know who to talk to or where they could talk to. It's that they don't feel comfortable reporting. As the Congressman mentioned, sometimes it's because they're concerned about them getting in trouble or somebody holding them accountable for some reason for reporting. Some of them are concerned about their family finding out, their friends finding out, their spouse finding out. Some of them are embarrassed. Some of them feel guilty about the incident. All of these things come together to create a problem where people don't feel comfortable stepping forward. It's something that we have to just work constantly. I don't have an easy answer for this one, Congresswoman, and, you know, new in the job or old, you're going to be shocked every time you hear this, just like I am.
Well, and do we have in the military, is there something specifically for this? Because this is crime.
Yes, ma'am. We have.
I mean, do we have a whistleblower protection in the military? Am I protected and know that I know, say as a female, that if I am the victim of a crime in this military, that I know I'm protected? And is there some, and I'm not familiar with the hierarchy in the military to understand that, am I protected if I go and say I'm a victim of a crime? Do we have a whistleblower protection?
Maybe. We don't have, there's no hard, firm law that says you're protected if you come forward and report something, and everybody's then going to make sure that you're never going to suffer a consequence for any action you took. I think in the past there have been many more incidents where people were held accountable for activity that was involved in or around an event where they became a victim. That's unacceptable. You heard General Rice mention that in this particular case, none of the victims have been held accountable, made to feel like they were guilty of anything. That's the way it has to be going forward. We have a sexual assault response coordinator at every organization. They are trained and certified to know how to handle these situations. As soon as we find out through any part of this reporting chain that we have a victim, the victim is contacted by the sexual assault response coordinator, and all the things that we can help provide are available to them. Not just law enforcement or investigative stuff. That's the last thing we want to worry about at that first contact. It's the personal care, the counseling, the health care, the forensic exam if required.
I appreciate it. And so if when I call and we report that incident, am I matched with, is it gender to gender reports? Am I reporting to a, if I'm raped, am I reporting to a woman?
In
Am I calling
in
a
every
woman?
case, you would not be. Anecdotally, the majority of our SARCs are women, but anecdotally, no, that's not the case everywhere.
And what's the ratio? I think somebody asked earlier, but I'm not sure. I just simply don't know. What's the ratio of basic military instructors? And I don't know all your acronyms. I apologize. But if you're a basic military instructor, what's the chance? How many women versus men percentage-wise do we have in the Air Force?
So about 11% women. We're moving to 25%.
Air Force-wide, it's about 19% women.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Enyart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Rice, would you agree with me that the command chiefs, with the commander, set the command climate of a unit?
I think command chiefs are an integral part of that, but I believe it is fundamentally the commander's responsibility to maintain the command climate within a unit.
And the command chief relays is the interlink, the interface between the enlisted folks, the NCOs, and the commander. Is that person not?
Certainly, yes, a critical link between the commander and the airmen within the unit.
General Rice, I'd like to know, how many female command chiefs do you have at Lackland Air Force Base, and how many do you have in the recruiting command?
I can't give you an exact number. I'd like to take that for the record, please.
I'd like to have that information back. Thank you. General Rice, can you tell me what is the accessibility that a female basic military trainee has to reaching out to a female command chief?
No, I can't give you an exact answer to that question. I would answer it this way. We have a number of females who are in the instructor or staff or supervisory or command positions. We are moving to a place where we have more females in those positions. I don't select commanders based on their gender. I don't select command chiefs based on their gender. I do believe at the military training instructor level that the team that is responsible for a flight of 50 trainees should include one female. But beyond that, we have not made another determination to make assignments of leadership positions based on gender.
Have you in any way, General Rice, empowered your command chiefs to deal with this problem that seems to be happening, or seems to have been happening? I'm sure that it's not happening now. But have you empowered your command chiefs to act with this? And if so, how?
Yeah. No. So at my level, I have not taken any direct action to specifically empower command chiefs other than making it mandatory that the rank of the command chief is no longer a senior master sergeant but a chief master sergeant, which is not a trivial matter. I believe you understand, based on your background, the significance of that. But fundamentally, I have to depend on a commander to use the resources that I have provided to him or her to maintain a proper command environment. And it's up to that commander to use those resources, whether it's a first sergeant, whether it's a command chief, whether it's an operations officer, whether it's a supervisor or anybody else, to use that combination of resources in a unique way, because every commander is different, to maintain good order and discipline and the proper command environment. And I think it's problematic if I start to dictate how they put that team of people together.
I would agree with you that it may well be problematic for you to do that, but I think you have a problem that needs to be dealt with. And I would suggest that, having dealt with those kind of problems in my previous career, that by setting the proper command climate, you can resolve those problems. And an inherent way of doing that is empowering and relying on your command chiefs. And by that I'm talking about the E9s, the Chief Master Sergeants, to aid the commander in ensuring that the NCOs, and every one of those TIs was an NCO, those NCOs fully understand the commander's intent. I'll yield the balance of my time.
Dr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for being here and for your service. We've heard a lot of discussion about the climate and what's being done to encourage individuals, victims, to report without fear of retribution. And General Rice, you talked about much of the training that goes on to try to impart the knowledge of how to report and what to report. I can tell you that as a military commander, I know well those training programs, both basic and recurrent. And the problem is, whether it's EO or consideration of others or prevention of sexual harassment, they seem to become stagnant PowerPoints where people are sitting in a classroom with eyes glazed over. Now, these programs have been going on for years, yet these incidents have occurred even while training programs have been put forward. How do you judge the effectiveness of those training programs that are supposed to be providing those initial entry service members or those that are on the front lines going through their annual recurrent trainings on these topics to make sure that they understand? Because it seems that the training that we do, and it's not the Air Force, I'm an Army guy, the training we do across the services isn't resonating. And, I mean, these incidents continue despite this ongoing initial entry and recurrent training. So how are we going to assess the training programs we have out there to try to stem the tide of these sexual assaults and associated sexual incidents?
Fantastic question, sir. Thank you. Exactly the question we're trying to answer right now. I mentioned before the volumes of training and education programs that we've had in place for years and we continue to keep in place, and we've added more. Every time we have an incident, we add more. All the services do this. The question is which ones are having an impact. And expand those, emphasize those, get rid of the rest of them and quit wasting resources on them and wasting people's time that could be better spent in a different way attacking this problem. The problem, we have talked to experts who are advising us on this topic. The one thing they told me that got my attention, because I'm more interested in seeing if it works quickly and then dumping it if we can't tell that it does and trying something else. The expert said you've got to be a little bit careful about that, because some of these things you won't know the impact until you give them time to work. Some of them are institutional education and changes, and it takes a while. So the tricky part for us right now is figuring out which ones do we stick with, and the ones we stick with we have to refresh, we have to modernize, we have to make them applicable to our young workforce, we have to put scenarios on YouTube, we have to do things, you know, TED Talks, we have to do the kinds of things that will attract them. Generally, that's scenario-based training and education. It's not PowerPoint, go home and look at it on the computer. That is not going to help. And so that's the type of effort we're focused on right now. How do we energize this training and bring it down to a personal level, not sitting in the back of the room with 500 of your closest friends sleeping through the latest sexual assault awareness training?
Well, I'm encouraged by that approach, and I hope it works, and I hope that you share it with our sister services. I can tell you far too often we've become more about training to time than the standard. And it's about sitting in the classroom and watching the slides go by for 30 minutes, regardless of the information that's being absorbed by the person sitting in the chair. So I applaud your efforts in trying to do some comprehensive assessment of what does work and making sure we push that out across the services. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Nome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. General Welsh, I have a question I believe should be directed towards you. How are the victims that were involved in this investigation at Lackland Air Force Base currently being cared for by the United States Air Force?
Thank you, ma'am. This is maybe the most important question of the day. They're being cared for as well as we possibly can. 59 victims, all were offered whatever level of support we could provide them. 57 of them accepted some level of assistance, whether it was health care, counseling, legal assistance, whatever it might be. General Rice can give you more of the details, the types of things they accepted. I'm not fully aware of that. We've tried to do everything we can with them. We offered them this new Special Victims Council, although it's not in place yet. We did offer some of them that in advance of the initial capability date because we knew there were trials coming up and wanted to help them through that. Some of them took advantage of that. Anything we can think of to do to help them, sadly, after the fact, we're trying to do.
Thank you. General Rice, could you shed some light on why some of these victims chose not to exercise every opportunity to get care and counseling from the United States Air Force?
I think there are a variety of reasons. As I've gotten feedback, it goes from some of them do not consider themselves victims, and so they have not wanted to have support. Others have considered the level of victimization, if you will, such that they don't require support, and others have made more full use of the support mechanisms that we have. So each one of these is a very individual case, an individual decision. I'm confident that we have made a good faith effort to offer the support and to conduct the investigations in a way that we have tried not to re-victimize the victims. We have tried to honor their requests. If they've said, you know, please, I just want to sort of move on here. I do think, and it's something I've talked to my team about, just as we have found out that oftentimes the initial answer to did something happen to you is no, that if we reapproach people in a different way over time, that we can get them to develop a sufficient level of trust that they will be more accurate with us, that because a victim said, no, I don't need any help, that we should go back at some appropriate time interval and re-ask and re-offer that assistance, because time does change people's perceptions of this. So we need to find the right way and time to do that, but I have that on my list of things to do here.
We've had a lot of discussion here today about lack of reporting, unwillingness to report incidences as they happen. And I think that right now every single airman is watching this situation and watching our victims to see how they're being treated and making decisions on whether to future report or to report on incidences that could be going on right now or could go on in the future, that you are building a reputation right now on how you respond to these victims, and it'll determine your success on getting more accountability, on getting more reporting of airmen being willing to come forward and talk about what may or may not be happening. So just know that as we work our way through this painful process and try to bring a resolution and improvement to it, that there are a lot of eyes on you, and there are a lot of eyes on how we're caring for the current victims that we have, and that we have an opportunity here to really do the best that we can to take care of them. I've looked at some of these recommendations that have come forward, and I just have a specific question about one or two of them, depending on how much time I have. One of the recommendations was A19, which says shorten the MTI tour length to a maximum of 3 years and do not allow follow-on special duty assignments. Were the MTIs that were perpetuating these crimes or assaults against the victims there for a longer period of times? Did they have a longer service rate in their position that they held? Is that why this recommendation has been accepted?
We did have some that were there for longer than 3 or 4 years. Typically, you won't serve as a military training instructor for that long. You'll move on to a supervisory position. So that recommendation is less about serving as a military training instructor than it is consistent participation in the whole process. So the idea is you serve one and then you move on to something else.
My concern was that I read this and I assumed that some of the perpetuators potentially were in these positions too long, and that maybe the climate within that position, as they were there for a long period of time, developed a attitude or an environment where they felt as though it was more acceptable the longer they were there. I guess that's the answer that I'm looking for, is there's no consistency on length of time in that position from the perpetuators? Okay. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'll yield back, Chairman.
Gentlemen, that concludes the questions we have for the first panel. Thank you very much for the work you're doing, and we'll excuse you and move to the second panel. Thank you. Can we please clear the witness table? We need to get the next panel up. Thank you. We have now, what timing? This is the call for our last series of votes for the day. But let's try to get as far as we can before we leave. We have on our second panel David Lisak, forensic consultant, Chief Master Sergeant Cindy McNally, United States Air Force, retired, with the Service Women's Action Network, and Technical Sergeant Jennifer Norris, U.S. Air Force, retired, from Protect Our Defenders. Mr. Lisak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and thank you to the committee for giving me this opportunity to speak to you this morning. I'm a clinical psychologist, a researcher, and a forensic consultant. For the past 25 years, I've studied rapists, and I've treated and evaluated men and women who've suffered sexual violence. For the past 10 years, I've worked extensively with the 4 services of the U.S. military, and simultaneously in the civilian sector, I've worked with dozens of universities across the United States and numerous law enforcement agencies and with state and local prosecutors. My extensive contact with both military and civilian institutions across the country provides me with a perspective on the problem of sexual violence that I would like to articulate to this committee. Sexual violence afflicts all nations and all societies. Societies are not distinguished by whether or not they have a problem of sexual violence, but rather by whether or not they actively and forthrightly confront the problem. The same is true for institutions within those societies. It's perhaps a little ironic, given the testimony that you've been hearing today, but in almost every respect, the U.S. military is doing more to confront sexual violence than any other institution in the United States. Nevertheless, despite their efforts, there are serious problems within the services that have either yet to be addressed or yet to be fully resolved. It will require many, many years of sustained effort and commitment to resolve these problems, and therefore many, many years of sustained scrutiny by this committee, by Congress more generally, and by advocacy groups, some of which are represented here today. However, the scrutiny and criticism of the military very often implies that its problems and shortcomings are somehow unique. In my opinion, this is not only grossly inaccurate, it also is a serious disservice to our country because it lets other institutions in this country off the hook. And in so doing, it puts the men and women in those institutions and communities at far greater risk of sexual violence. Specifically, our universities have not confronted their problems of sexual violence with anything like the commitment shown in the services. There are a few exceptions. However, in no university have I ever seen the type of commitment from leadership, the comprehensive prevention efforts, the sustained efforts at tackling the very challenging problems that I've witnessed in the services. Perhaps the most scathing criticism that the military has received has been focused on its shortcomings in prosecuting cases of sexual violence. Again, I believe that this criticism is necessary. However, our country would be well served if the criticism of the military's prosecution record was placed in the context of the civilian prosecution of sexual violence. With rare exceptions, again, there are enormous problems with the prosecution of non-stranger sexual assaults in civilian jurisdictions. Non-stranger cases represent the vast majority of all sexual assaults. They are challenging cases to investigate and prosecute, and very few civilian jurisdictions have made the necessary efforts to train their staffs to competently and effectively take on these cases. As a result, many non-stranger cases are inadequately investigated and never even taken to a courtroom. Many local prosecutors fail to prosecute the types of non-stranger cases that military prosecutors are now increasingly taking to court. The services are making efforts, and you heard reference to some of these this morning, to increase the effectiveness of their criminal justice response to sexual violence. As just one example, and I think this was mentioned already, the Army has developed a 2-week course to train investigators in state-of-the-art techniques for investigating non-stranger sexual assault cases, and 440 investigators are now being trained each year. This is an example of one of the much-needed improvements that needs to take place in the military's criminal justice response to sexual assault, but it will take time for these improvements to take hold and be felt. And there is much, much more work to be done. Improved training for investigators and military prosecutors must continue to evolve, and it must be sustained. The services must confront the problem of junior litigators handling complex sexual assault cases far too early in their professional development. Unhelpful biases and attitudes are still present among some investigators, prosecutors, and commanders, and these must be addressed through a process of culture change that I think has been already stated will be a permanent process. I hope that my testimony will not be taken here either as an apology for the military's handling of sexual assault or as yet another criticism of its efforts. Based on my experience working with the services, both very good and very bad things are still happening. This is the reality in an institution that is undergoing significant and meaningful change, and I suspect it will be a reality for some years to come. It is impossible to average these good and bad things. They are simply both true. If the services sustain their efforts, if Congress continues to provide clear-eyed scrutiny, and crucially, if Congress provides the resources that the services need to sustain their efforts, I believe that the United States military will lead the rest of the country in demonstrating what it means to confront sexual violence honestly and with sustained commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergeant McNally.
Good afternoon, Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee. I sit before you today having experienced sexual assault in the Air Force from multiple perspectives. First, as a survivor of sexual assault when I was a young airman. Second, as an enlisted troop who has spent her entire career as an aircraft maintainer. And third, as a retired Chief Master Sergeant who has supervised 1,500 enlisted troops as a maintenance group superintendent. I have had direct dealings with all the personnel issues that come with supervising people in today's Air Force, and I'll be sharing that perspective with you today. I enlisted in the Air Force in 1975 and was assigned to a WAF squadron, a Women in the Air Force squadron at Lackland Air Force Base. At that time, women trainees were segregated from men both physically and in our course curriculum. Following basic training, I attended technical training at Chanute Air Force Base, where I began my integration into the Air Force. It was there that I was sexually assaulted by 2 of my instructors. I reported the incident, believing that my leaders would handle it, and that didn't happen. I knew then that I would never, ever report another sexual assault. In fact, a year later, at my first assignment, I was sexually assaulted again. I did not report it, nor did I ever discuss either of these 2 incidences until after I retired 28 years later and was being treated for PTSD. While many things have changed in the Air Force since I enlisted, the trauma of sexual assault has not changed. It feels like someone has reached into you and sucked the soul right out of you. It is traumatic and it is ugly. And for those of us who have survived it, we do so because of our strength and our will to overcome what could otherwise be a crippling episode in our lives. I remained in the Air Force, proud of my service, however. The reason I served far outweighed any single incident in my life. this was my choice. I also served alongside the nation's finest in an Air Force where honor, integrity, and service before self are a way of life. Our job as enlisted leaders is to define the standard and make everyone absolutely understand that we have no problem removing anybody in a blink of an eye if they cross that standard. And maybe that's where General Rice and I somewhat disagree. I believe the enlisted leaders are one of the most important people in the military to stop this epidemic. To me, the sexual assault cases at Lackland demonstrate what happens when leadership fails. Basic training is where our sons and daughters are at their very vulnerable. The power that military training instructors, or TIs, have over airmen is perceived as absolute. Turning young men and women from all over our country into airmen is a transformational process where the TI represents the sole success of that transformation. Turning to female leaders when assaults have occurred is not always an answer. The true yardstick for an effective leader has nothing to do with their gender. I have worked with many men who have sent a stringent work environment where all airmen are free from harassment and a threatening workplace. NCOs in the chain of command have an overarching duty to take care of their troops. Doing what is right is genderless. I have followed closely the recommended actions in the midst of Lackland disgrace, and I've discussed some of these with Swan, and I've had the privilege of talking to General Woodward, and I applaud her for her efforts in looking into these issues. I believe the following steps that are being taken will have a positive effect on the training environment at Lackland. I agree we should increase the number of female MTIs to at least the percentage that they are in the Air Force. All basic training students should be exposed to both male and female NCOs. This is, after all, who will be leading them. Increasing instructor-to-student ratio is an absolute must. I was shocked to find out that the TI-to-student ratio was roughly the same as when I went through basic training 35 years ago. A reasonable student-to-instructor ratio is Education 101. I also agree with the requirement to raise the rank of MTIs. Technical sergeants and master sergeants are seasoned leaders and have a good deal of experience in deterring, identifying, and taking action. However, a non-voluntary TI assignment didn't work before, and it won't work now. I have had troops who viewed TI duty as the death knell for their career. That needs to change to attract the type of people suited to train our next generation of leaders. Incentives to attract the best of the answer, not non-voluntary duty assignments. Additionally, I do not believe women should be segregated. We train as we fight, one team. Segregation in training did more harm than good in attempts to integrate us into the Air Force. We want to be viewed as airmen first, and you cannot do that coming from a segregated unit. Our own history with racial integration should tell us that. For larger solutions, we need to look at integrating women completely into the armed forces. Remove the combat exclusion policy. Then we will be a fully integrated force. Being able to do the job should be the standard, not whether you are male or female. I believe that as leaders, we took our eye off the ball. We enabled a climate where our troops became vulnerable. And we can train and train, but in the end, it is about leadership. We draw the line on what is acceptable behavior, define it, and enforce it. I don't believe we can legislate leadership, but we can certainly have you hold our leaders responsible and legally liable for the welfare of their troops. That's an absolute must. In the maintenance career field, where all our leaders are passionate about doing what is right to protect our pilots while they fly, our leaders need to feel as passionate about protecting our troops as they do the flying mission. You cannot minimize risk to zero, but leaders can and better make sure they're there to make the right decision and do the right thing. Our troops demand nothing less. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The vote is just about at an end. I have to recess the committee at this time to give everybody an opportunity to vote. We will vote and return. It will be, it looks like, at least a half hour. Thank you.
I was like, tell both my story. I just said, I don't know what right now. I just I can't do it at the moment. I'm sorry. I apologize. I have to decide other things. Undo my cord though. Huh? Now that'd be lovely if he wanted to come with us walking somewhere.
I said it like you told me to. Well. What?
Yeah. I'm not even over.
Well, the hearing's not starting, but yeah. I'll be back.
I mean, yeah, I'm just, it doesn't start until 2 hours.
With the Senate in a quorum call and the House service hearing taking a break, here's a clip from the Senate Foreign Relations hearing on the 9/11 attack in Benghazi. Secretary Clinton is answering questions from Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson.
Where in real time, again, I realize how big your job is and everything is erupting in the Middle East this time. Were you fully aware of these 20 incidents that were reported in the ARB in real time? I mean,
I was aware of the ones that were brought to my attention. They were part of our ongoing discussion about the deteriorating threat environment in eastern Libya. We certainly were very conscious of them. I was assured by our security professionals that repairs were underway, additional security upgrades had taken place.
Thank you. Did you see personally the cable on, I believe it was August 12th, specifically asking for basically reinforcements for the security detail that was going to be evacuating or leaving in August? Did you see that personally?
No, sir.
Okay. When you read the ARB, it strikes me as how certain the people were that the attack started at 9:40 Benghazi time. When was the first time you spoke to, or have you ever spoken to the returnees, the evacuees? Did you personally speak to those folks?
I've spoken to one of them, but I waited until after the ARB had done its investigation because I did not want there to be anybody raising any issue that I had spoken to anyone before the ARB conducted its investigation.
How many people were evacuated from Libya?
Well, the numbers are a little bit hard to pin down because of our other friends, approximately 25 to 30.
Did anybody in the State Department talk to those folks very shortly afterwards?
There was discussion going on afterwards, but once the investigation started, the FBI spoke to them before we spoke to them. And so other than our people in Tripoli, which I think you're talking about Washington, right?
Yeah, the point I'm making is a very simple phone call to these individuals I think would have ascertained immediately that there was no protest prior to this. I mean, this attack started at 9:40 p.m. Benghazi time, and it was an assault. And I appreciate the fact that you called it an assault. But, I mean, I'm going back to then Ambassador Rice, 5 days later going to Sunday shows and what I would say purposefully misleading the American public.
Well,
why wasn't that known? And again, I appreciate the fact of the transparency of this hearing, but why weren't we transparent at that point in time?
Well, first of all, Senator, I would say that once the assault happened and once we got our people rescued and out, our most immediate concern was, number one, taking care of their injuries. As I said, I still have a DS agent at Walter Reed seriously injured. Getting them into Frankfurt, Ramstein to get taken care of, the FBI going over immediately to start talking to them. We did not think it was appropriate for us to talk to them before the FBI conducted their interviews. So, and we did not, I think this is accurate, sir, I certainly did not know of any reports that contradicted the IC talking points at the time that Ambassador Rice went on the TV shows. And, you know, I just want to say that, you know, people have accused Ambassador Rice and the administration of, you know, misleading Americans. I can say, trying to be in the middle of this and understanding what was going on, nothing could be further from the truth. Was information developing? Was the situation fluid? Would we reach conclusions later that weren't reached initially? And I appreciate the...
Madam Secretary, do you disagree with me that a simple phone call to those evacuees to determine what happened wouldn't have ascertained immediately that there was no protest? I mean, that was a piece of information that could have been easily obtained.
Well, but Senator,
within hours, if not days.
Senator, you know, when you're in these positions, the last thing you want to do is interfere with any other process going on.
I realize that's a good excuse.
Number two, well, no, it's the fact. Number two, I would recommend highly you read both what the ARB said about it and the classified ARB, because even today there are questions being raised. Now, we have no doubt they were terrorists, they were militants, they attacked us, they killed our people. But what was going on and why they were doing what they were doing?
No. Again, we were misled that there were supposedly protests and then something sprang out of that, an assault sprang out of that. And that was easily ascertained that that was not the fact. And the American people could have known that within days, and they didn't know that.
With all due respect, the fact is we had 4 dead Americans. Was it because of a protest, or was it because of guys out for a walk one night who decided they'd go kill some Americans? What difference at this point does it make? It is our job to figure out what happened and do everything we can to prevent it from ever happening again, Senator. Now, honestly, I will do my best to answer your questions about this, but the fact is that people were trying in real time to get to the best information. The IC has a process, I understand, going with the other committees to explain how these talking points came out. But you know, to be clear, it is, from my perspective, less important today, looking backwards, as to why these militants decided they did it than to find them and bring them to justice. And then maybe we'll figure out what was going on in the meantime.
Okay.
The Senate remains in a quorum call, and the House Armed Services Committee hearing is on break until at least 1:30. We'll continue to show you some of this morning's Senate Foreign Relations hearing on the 9/11 attack in Benghazi. Secretary Clinton answers questions from Tennessee Senator Bob Corker.
Secretary, I agree with you. When people go into the field to do the things they do it knowing of the risk. And I agree with you, one of the untold stories here is the the heroic nature of many in Libya and what they did to save lives. I met several of the JSOC folks and others that risked their lives saving others. But I also have to say, in reading all the cables and that many of us have done, there were systemic deficiencies, and I know you know that. And I'd like for you to just speak to that for a moment. To my knowledge, no one has been held accountable. Our staff had a meeting with one of the State Department officials, and I hate to use this word again, but it was nothing short of bizarre as they talked about the communications. These officials were screaming out for more security, and I'm just wondering if you might mention one reform that would be helpful so that you would have known of the needs there of security that went undone.
Well, obviously I have thought about this almost constantly since that date, Senator, because, you know, I do feel responsible. I feel responsible for the nearly 70,000 people who work for the State Department. I take it very seriously. But the specific security requests pertaining to Benghazi, you know, were handled by the security professionals in the department. I didn't see those requests. They didn't come to me. I didn't approve them. I didn't deny them. That's obviously one of the findings that Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen made, that, you know, these requests don't ordinarily come to the Secretary of State.
But if we could, I know there's I respect you tremendously, but we have a short amount of time. They did come in to folks.
That's right.
We did have SST people on the ground at no cost to the State Department. They were asked to be extended by the ambassador. Someone at the State Department turned that down. They were at no charge, 16 officers. So I just wonder what has happened inside to make sure that never happens again.
Well, several things. Not only are we on the path to implement all of the ARB recommendations, but we've gone beyond that. We did immediately do this high threat assessment using DOD assets as well as our own. That had never been done before. We have asked the Congress to help us reallocate funds. The Senate has given us that authority. We don't yet have it from the House, so that we can get more Marine Guards, we can get more diplomatic security guards, we can try to put more money into the maintenance, the upgrades, construction that's needed. I created the first ever, it sounds like it should have been done years ago, but first ever Deputy Assistant Secretary for High Threats. I'm also recommending that there be a regular process that includes the Secretary and the deputies in these decisions, because nobody wants to sit where I am and, you know, have to think now about what coulda, shoulda, woulda happened in order to avoid this. Now, as I said, we've had 19 ARBs. Only 2 have ever been unclassified. The one coming out of the East Africa bombings, where there was full transparency, there was a set of recommendations, many of which have been implemented along with recommendations from other ARBs, but this committee never had a public hearing about the 17 other ARBs because they were classified. So we're putting into action steps that we think will help the next secretary be able to make these decisions, be part of these decisions, have more insight into what is going on, and we would obviously welcome the opportunity to work closely with a subcommittee or a set of members to make sure that that's what's happening.
Well, thank you. I will, this many 19 or 17 have been done. I will say none of them have ever been fully implemented.
Senator, that's not accurate, because I heard you say that when Bill Burns and Tom Nides were here, and it shocked me. So we went back, we did a full and thorough investigation. The vast majority have been implemented, and we will give you a report to that effect, because that's the kind of, to go back to your point, Senator, if there were an authorization process, that's the kind of information that would be shared. And I see my former compatriot on the Armed Services Committee. There is always an Armed Services authorization, and there needs always to be a Foreign Relations Committee authorization.
The Senate remains in a quorum call, and the House Armed Services Committee hearing remains on break. We'll continue to show you some of this morning's Senate Foreign Relations hearing on the 9/11 attack in Benghazi. Now Secretary Clinton answers questions from New Jersey Senator Robert Menendez, who's chairing the hearing.
What I was doing on September 11th, I was at the State Department all day and late into the night. During most of the day, prior to getting notice of the attack on our compound in Benghazi, we were very focused on our embassy in Cairo. That was under assault by a group of protesters. We were assessing the security of our embassy, which is, as those of you who have been there, certainly well defensed, but there were crowds that were intent upon trying to scale the wall, and we were in close communication with our team in Cairo. I was notified of the attack shortly after 4 p.m. Over the following hours, we were in continuous meetings and conversations, both within the department, with our team in Tripoli, with the interagency, and internationally. I instructed our senior department officials and our diplomatic security personnel to consider every option to just break down the doors of the Libyan officials to get as much security support as we possibly could to coordinate with them. I spoke to the National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, several times. I briefed him on developments. I sought all possible support from the White House, which they quickly provided. Tom was my first call. I spoke with our chargé in Tripoli to get situation updates. I spoke with former CIA Director Petraeus to confer and coordinate, given the presence of his facility, which of course was not well known, but was something that we knew and wanted to make sure we were closely lashed up together. I talked with the then Libyan National Congress President to press him on greater support, not only in Benghazi, but also in Tripoli. I participated in a secure video conference of senior officials from the intelligence community, the White House, and DOD. We were going over every possible option, reviewing all that was available to us, any actions we could take. We were reaching out to everyone we could find to try to get an update about Ambassador Chris Stevens, also our information specialist, Sean Smith. So it was a constant, ongoing discussion and sets of meetings. I spoke with President Obama later in the evening to, bring him up to date, to hear his perspective. Obviously, we kept talking with everyone during the night. Early in the morning on the 12th, I spoke with General Dempsey, again with Tom Donilon. The two hardest calls that I made were obviously to the families of Ambassador Stevens and Sean Smith. And they, I have to say, were extraordinary in their responses and their understanding of the pride we had in both men and gratitude we had for their service. I would also just quickly add, Mr. Chairman, that while this was going on and we were trying to understand it, get on top of it, we were continuing to face protests, demonstrations, violence across the region and as far as India and Indonesia. There were so many protests happening, and thousands of people were putting our facilities at risk. So we were certainly very determined to do whatever we could about Benghazi. We were relieved when we finally got the last of the Americans out of Benghazi, but then we were turning around dealing with the very serious threats facing so many of our other facilities.
Thank you.
Today. The Senate is in a quorum call waiting for a senator to come to the floor to speak. The Senate's in a quorum call waiting for a senator to come to the floor to speak. Negotiations are underway off the floor to revise Senate filibuster rules. While we wait, we're going to take you to a news conference with Senate Democrats on a bill in the House today to suspend the federal debt limit for about 3 months and tie members getting paid to each body passing a budget.
Today I'm pleased that Speaker Boehner and his House colleagues have decided to change course and pass a bill that diffuses yet another fight over the debt ceiling. The most important aspect of this legislation that they're going to vote on, I understand, in the House today, is that it surrenders the hostage Republicans took in the past. It decouples the full faith and credit of the United States from cuts to Social Security and Medicare or anything else. In substance, this is a clean debt limit increase that will set the precedent for future debt ceiling extensions that we'll have to have. By passing this bill, the Republicans are joining Democrats to say we will not hold the full faith and credit of the United States hostage. We will pay the bills that we have incurred. Over the last 2 years, the Bipartisan Budget Control Act set spending levels in place of a congressional budget. So, folks, please, every time you hear the Republicans talk about our not having passed a budget, understand it is not true. In fact, Republicans voted on the Budget Control Act. They helped us pass it. It was a law. As Senator Murray announced today, this year the Senate will return to regular order and move a budget resolution through the Budget Committee to the Senate floor. The House Republicans had to add a gimmick or two to their bill, but I understand, we all understand, the Tea Party plays a big part in what goes on in the House, and they need a gimmick or two to get things done over there. But to spare the middle class another knockdown, drag-out fight, we're going to proceed to work on this legislation and get it out of here as quickly as we can. I also want to give credit where credit is due. And I thank Speaker Boehner for his leadership in diffusing a fight over the debt ceiling debate. See, as I've said before, not everything here has to be a big fight. This proposal that they have in the House isn't worth fighting about. So again, I thank the Speaker for his work in this regard. The middle class has been telling us they don't want another crisis, and this bill gives them the security that they deserve. Senator Durbin?
Thank you, Mr. Leader. America is suffering from confrontation fatigue. They've had enough of it. They want us to get down to work to solve the problems and challenges facing our nation. They certainly don't want to see America default on its debt for the first time in its history. They don't want to see the interest rate go up on the debt that we have to pay. As Chairman Murray can tell you from the Budget Committee, for every 1% that our interest rate goes up because of confrontations and doomsday scenarios, it costs the American taxpayers $1 trillion over 10 years. $1 trillion. So this confrontation fatigue across America has led to some dramatic rethinking in the House of Representatives. Today, the vote in the House of Representatives sets an important precedent going forward. The House will have made the decision that bedrock safety net programs will not be held hostage by dangerous threats to default on our debt. House Republicans will soon vote in favor of something they promised they would never accept, a debt ceiling increase that is not coupled with deep, painful, unfair cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, that's exactly how we ought to operate going forward. The debt ceiling, the confidence of global financial markets, and the full faith and credit of the United States are now and will continue to be a separate conversation from the balanced deficit reduction we can and should achieve in the months ahead. We stand ready to work with the Republicans on just such an agreement. Over the past 2 years, I have been working on a bipartisan basis and saying that everything should be on the table and that any deficit reduction plan must be balanced. Unfortunately, up to this point, Senator McConnell and some Senate Republicans have refused to engage in deficit reduction discussions that included revenue and spending cuts. I hope the Republican leader and his caucus will change course, joining the Senate Democrats in deficit reduction discussions that are truly balanced, strengthen the safety net across America, protect the vulnerable people in our nation, and improve the progressivity of our tax code for working families. These are important debates that help us determine where we as a country are headed. But we expect and require that the Tea Party element stick to the precedent it's setting today. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid will not be held hostage to the debt limit.
Sure.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank my colleagues. First, you know, I'm not sure what happened at the House Republican retreat last week, but it sure had a mellowing effect on their members. Maybe there were deep breathing exercises, soft jazz music, but something good happened. Either way, we welcome the outcome of their retreat. The bill represents a huge de-escalation on the debt ceiling issue. It hands the President his second major win in a month, and it shows that the Republicans are in full-on retreat on fiscal policy. President Obama has consistently said he'd refuse to negotiate around the debt ceiling. His strategy is vindicated now that the Republicans have backed off their threats to take the nation into a default. The President stared down the Republicans. They blinked because they realized they didn't have the leverage they thought they would. This is the President's second big victory in a row, coming after the New Year's Eve agreement that ended Bush tax breaks for the wealthiest 2% of Americans. Now, gambling with default was never a sound plan by the Republicans. Substantively, we all know, the markets know, business knows, Americans know, it was playing with fire. But politically, it was a loser as well. Americans had a bad taste in their mouths after the debt ceiling crisis in 2011. Polls showed the public blamed Republicans back then, and they would have again this time, even more so. In recent weeks, many conservative opinion makers had been warning Republicans this was a losing fight. Even Senator Cornyn was getting cold feet last week about the idea after initially sounding bullish about it. And the House Republican proposal is a major concession in two ways. First, it takes the near threat of a default off the table. Second, it ends the so-called Boehner rule, which insisted on dollar-for-dollar cuts to match any increase in the debt ceiling. This sets a new precedent that debt ceiling will not be taken hostage going forward. So obviously, we Democrats would prefer a longer-term extension than 3 months. Keeping the nation's creditors in suspense on a monthly basis about whether we're going to fulfill our obligations is not an ideal way to run the government. But the bottom line, this proposal gives us something we can work with here in the Senate. In the short term, it removes the threat of default. For the long term, it sets a helpful precedent that's going to make raising the debt ceiling easier from now on.
Senator Murray.
Well, for the last several years, congressional Republicans have held the full faith and credit of the United States of America hostage to score political points and appease their Tea Party base. Instead of doing what Congress has always done under presidents of both parties and allow the government to pay the bills it has accrued, they decided to play a game of chicken with the global economy. Up until now, Republicans have been all about politics and point scoring. But you know, to families who've been watching this debate across the country, it was about their jobs and their paychecks and their future. When Republicans put us through this in 2011, it led S&P to downgrade our debt. The day Speaker Boehner announced that he would not allow a clean debt ceiling, consumer confidence began falling, job growth slowed, and the recovery faltered. It was a self-inflicted wound at a time when we needed to be working together to grow the economy, not slow it down. The 2011 debt limit brinkmanship led to the Budget Control Act and highlighted to the American people just how extreme Republicans were when it came to their budget priorities. You would think they would have learned their lesson, but the manufactured crisis didn't end, and the uncertainty the Republicans have caused has been hurting our economy again and again. So I'm very glad the Republicans have stepped back from the precipice when it comes to the debt limit and essentially admitted that their demand of the last 2 years for spending cuts equal to the debt limit increase is both absurd and unworkable. Now, they may have needed to throw in some red meat to the Tea Party to move a clean debt limit increase through the House, whatever. I certainly, in fact, would have also appreciated to have a longer-term bill that provides more certainty. But this sets a new precedent, and it makes very clear that they can't use this issue as a political pawn anymore. Now, this morning I announced that the Senate will be moving a pro-growth, pro-middle-class budget resolution through the committee and to the Senate floor. I discussed this path with my colleagues in the weeks before I officially became chair, and we plan to move on a budget resolution regardless of whether the House rolls this issue into their short-term bill to increase the debt limit. But I'm hopeful that when Republicans say they want to return to the regular budget process, they actually really mean it. That means that the constant crisis over manufactured deadlines need to end. The brinkmanship needs to stop, and they truly need to work with us towards the balanced and bipartisan budget deal that the American people expect and deserve. Thank you.
Senator Reid.
Yes.
You all say that this sets a precedent for removing the so-called Boehner rule for future debt ceiling increases. Republicans, on the other hand, say that they're just reordering things and they have better ground to fight on when it comes to sequester, when it comes to CR, and that furthermore, future debt ceiling increases will have to have the Boehner rule as part of it. How do you square those two?
There's no way to square it.
Yeah, can I answer that?
Please.
You know, as I said, I intend to move forward a budget resolution through the Senate to deal with the sequestration replacement and to set appropriations levels so that we can move forward. The House Republicans can't have it both ways. If they want us, and we want to, move a budget resolution through in regular process, then they can't have brinkmanship on every crisis that they manufacture for the next 6 months. So I hope that they stop doing this brinksmanship, bring our country back to a place where we can do the regular order, as they have asked us to, move our budget resolutions through, and find a resolution to reach a fair and balanced deal at the end of the day.
Senator Reid, you haven't said what you're going to do with this legislation. Are you going to simply take it up and pass it as is?
Yes.
By voice vote? Do you think you could just go by receipt?
I don't know if the Republicans will vote for it. I'll see.
Senator Reid?
Yes.
Senator McConnell said yesterday on the issue of revenue going forward in a budget resolution or elsewhere that there wasn't a single Republican vote in Congress for revenue. He didn't say taxes. He said for revenue, which is kind of dialing the clock back to sort of where we were, a long time ago. How do you see going forward, if indeed that is the case and there's not a single Republican vote for any revenue?
Well, if you go back a few months, that's what they said then.
Right.
Well.
Do you think it's true? Do you think now that President Obama got his tax increase that there will be intransigence on revenue?
Of course there has to be a balanced approach. It's not going to be all done with cuts.
The person to ask this is Senator Durbin, who has sat on bipartisan budget negotiations with the Gang of Six and with Simpson-Bowles, who all put forward balanced approaches to our debt and deficit. And that has not changed.
Dick, is that...
Yeah.
I can just tell you that the amount of revenue that we generated after the fiscal cliff negotiation is still short of any of the numbers that were suggested either by Simpson-Bowles or by the Gang of Six. We all understood that if we're going to have spending cuts, balanced spending cuts, it includes revenue. And I struggle to understand this notion that they won't even accept $1 in revenue coming out of tax reform. That has always been the mantra on the Republican side. We're going to simplify the tax code and so forth. There's room within the tax code, and I'm sure Senator Schumer, as a member of the Finance Committee, can speak to that. There's room within the tax cut for us to reduce the deficit and still protect the middle class and promote growth, as Senator Murray said.
Leader Reid, some of this just came from the House Democratic caucus, and they were rather negative on this plan. I mean, very stark hearing, it almost sounds like good cop, bad cop here. The House Democrats were very much opposed to this. Is there a disconnect in the party?
We believe strongly that this is a way forward. As Senator Schumer said, this is clearly a victory for the president. There's no longer the brinksmanship, and that's why I threw bouquets on more than one occasion during my remarks to the Speaker. That's how we feel.
Senator,
Yes.
There's consensus in Congress that there needs to be a broad deficit reduction package. Will that be in the form of the Senate Democratic budget, or will there be a separate deficit reduction package outside of the regular order?
Anything we do will be based on a budget. Now, we do things separate and apart from that, but the framework for our moving forward is the budget that Senator Murray has indicated she's going to move forward with.
Senator Murray, are you defining part of that
You
by...
talked on Sunday about tax reform, and I know Senator Durbin just mentioned it. Can you be a bit more specific about how you intend to move forward on
Tax
that?
reform.
Well, it's very simple, and as Senator Durbin correctly said, it's always been a Republican mantra: close the loopholes and use those monies. Now, we think some of those should be used for revenue. So did Bowles Simpson. So that's been what all the discussions have been about. We haven't changed our position, and I don't think, I hope they haven't changed theirs.
But how will it work procedurally? Will it be embedded
Well,
in the budget?
that'll be up to the Budget Committee and the Finance Committee, Patty and Max, and we'll all discuss that. I don't know if you want to say.
Are you in favor of using reconciliation instructions to...
I know what did you say that again?
Do you favor using reconciliation instructions in the budget?
Senator Murray, we talked about that on the way over here.
As I just said, we are going to put out our budget resolution. I'll be working with the chairman of the Finance Committee, the members of my budget, to make a determination now on the best path forward on the answer to all those questions.
If Speaker Boehner can't round up 217 Republicans for this bill today, would it be your preference that House Democrats push it over the finish line so they come over to
We have enough problems over here determining what we do. That's up to, I always call her the Speaker. That's always up to Ms. Pelosi and Hoyer decide what they're going to do over there. One last question.
Senator, I have a question on the budget piece of this. Why the shift in approach in doing an actual budget? And specifically for Senator Schumer, I remember that Kent Conrad had wanted to do one for a while. Rank and file members were agitating to do it. And particularly in the summer of 2011, there was a push not to do it because it might muddle the messaging against the House Republican budget and also
You didn't listen. You didn't listen to what I said. And what I said is that any comments, any conversation, any statements made by the Republicans about our not having a budget is false. It's untrue. We passed the Budget Control Act. We passed it with the help of Republicans. We didn't have to do a budget. You folks listen to that. Stop taking that bait.
It's a slogan. It's not reality. We're under the Budget Control Act as we speak. There are limits that are placed on every level of spending. There are levels placed on every level of spending. Right now, we're under a budget. We're under the Budget Control Act. We have been for the last year and a half.
But are you going to go through the vote-a-rama? That is one of the things that...
Unless you can figure a way out of it.
The House has passed a bill to permit the government to borrow enough money to avoid a default for at least 4 months. The House passed the measure by a 285 to 144 vote. You just heard the Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid say the chamber would immediately move to advance the legislation to the White House, which has announced that President Obama would sign it. The Senate is currently in a quorum call. We're waiting for a senator to come to the floor. They're speaking on a range of topics today. Off-the-floor negotiations continue on changing the Senate filibuster rules. The Senate remains in a quorum call. The Senate does this while waiting for a senator to come to the floor to speak. Earlier today, several senators gave general speeches while negotiations continue off the floor over changing Senate rules on the filibuster. While we wait for a senator to speak, we're going to take you to the Armed House Services Committee, which is investigating sexual misconduct allegations at Lackland Air Force Base, where the Air Force trains recruits.
And kick the victim out. Often, legislative reforms are inconsistently applied, unnecessarily encumbered, or just not implemented. In my work as an advocate, it breaks my heart to see the same problems today that existed when I joined 16 years ago. Sorry. 39% of female victims report their perpetrator was of higher rank, and 23% report it was someone in their chain of command. The Air Force's Lackland report and previous reports indicate a failure of leadership. How many more times must Congress hear this before enacting fundamental reform? Why didn't the Air Force interview the victims to determine if they tried to report or feared reporting, and why? According to the DoD's own data, 47% of service members are afraid to report because of the reprisals that occur. This isn't just an Air Force problem. It is service-wide. Many secretaries of defense have declared a zero-tolerance policy, yet recent actions challenge that notion. In September, Secretary Panetta proposed the President sign an executive order which would have eviscerated the military's rape shield rule. In 2011, the military argued in court that rape is incident to service. Had I known this, that the military dismisses rape as an occupational hazard, I would never have joined. According to the LA Times in 1992, in response to the tailhook scandal, quote, several lawmakers proposed stripping the armed services of their role in probing sexual molestation cases. The deference and patience that Congress has shown the DoD has come at great cost to our service members, our security, and ultimately our society. Retired Brigadier General Lori Sutton recently said, the only credible solution is an independent special victims unit completely outside the unit chain of command, under professional civilian oversight. And I agree. I ask you, as our elected representatives, please, please don't let this wait. God bless our brave men and women in uniform.
I want to thank all of you for your testimony, and thank you, Tech Sergeant, for your courage to be here today and to tell us your story. Certainly, acts of sexual assault under any conditions are especially heinous, but when committed by those in position of power and under the color of authority, they are especially reprehensible. And we certainly appreciate you taking the time to be here today. This question is to Ms. McNally and Ms. Norris. The DoD and the military services have taken a number of steps, albeit maybe not enough, to develop, assess, and refine their respective sexual assault prevention and response programs. As individuals who are regularly involved with providing or coordinating care and other services for victims of these violent crimes, such as sexual assault, what do you consider to be the trademarks of a good response program? I'll go to the Chief first.
Thank you. One of the first things that I think that has been a big problem is understanding why we go unreported. And And I know I could see that the generals were putting their arms around this very same thing, trying to explain that. And I can tell you, speaking for myself and for some of the victims that I supervised over the years, that they don't report it because, number one, it is so traumatic, it is so ugly, and they know that it will be public knowledge. And so the number one fear, no matter how compassionate you are, is that this will go out. And how could I have let this happen to me? You know, the men have the same response when they are sexually assaulted. So the number one thing is something very personal, very ugly, very traumatic is going to be public knowledge. That's one of the biggest fears. The second thing is that it's a he said, she said. And unless you see evidence that commanders have removed from the service with consequences, anybody who enables an environment that allows harassment to even start, then you have no trust in your system. You have to see evidence, you know, not whack-a-mole responses to whatever crisis comes up in the sexual assault thing. And finally is the, you know, we have the he said, she said, and then we have what everyone likes to use the word accountability, and I think that's thrown around a lot. That just means we moved them to another assignment. He needs to be responsible. They need to be held liable. So these are basically the three reasons why people don't report sexual assault. Until they understand that, they cannot present a viable sexual response, you know, a sexual assault response program in any place, whether it be in the Air Force or in college. I mean, that is the fundamental thing you've got to get your arms around and understand. They should not come to you. You should be out there talking to them, you know, talking to your troops. And commanders can't do that. The senior enlisted can do that. The commanders can't do that.
Hey, Tech Sergeant, anything to add?
I provided you with my personal testimony to give you a little bit of background so that we didn't have to go into detail. But unfortunately, the rape and the three different other predators who assaulted me, it all occurred within the first 2 years of my career. And for those who have served in the military, you recognize quickly that rank does come with privileges, meaning when you're lower enlisted, you're that guy or girl, and you're new to the institution, so you haven't been able to establish the credibility necessary to make a claim against someone that's been there for 18 years and appears to be the best friend of or the right-hand man of the commander. You're stuck. If you want a career, you don't want to say anything because you get retaliated against. You get thrown out. You get beat up. And that's what we need to stop. We need to remove the chain of command from the reporting process. It's absolutely detrimental to us being able to report safely. And if you think about it, it's actually good for the perpetrator, too. Not that I stand up for them by any means, but a fair process would be a fair process for both. So think about it. Commander, 18-year veteran, active duty guy just raped me, and I know he's your buddy and best friend, and he's had your back this whole time. I know I just entered, and I'm just a little old E1, but just wanted to let you know. It doesn't work that way. You're too scared to tell the commander because, first of all, it's alleged in every case. Very much of a trigger for me. Second of all, others start to think that, oh no, you got to be careful around that girl because she might just say that you sexually assaulted her. And so you almost become a leper. And because of the small community within a squadron, the rumor mill starts flying. The victim doesn't want to talk about what happened. They don't want to, I didn't want to tell anybody what happened to me aside from the commander because he was the only person I had to go to. I wanted it kept confidential. I was ashamed. I was embarrassed. I couldn't believe that it happened and continued to happen and pushed me to the point where I was forced to report to prevent another rape. So this small squadron business where they're putting the commanders in charge, I'm not saying every commander's a bad man or a bad woman. You know, what I'm saying is that to put that decision-making authority in one person's hands, that's a lot to ask of not only the commander, but also for the rest of us. You know, he decides one thing, I don't agree with it. What recourse do I have? None. So if they decide they don't want to believe you, have fun with that.
Thank you. Dr. Lissack, based on your experience in both the military and civilian sectors, is it your view that the U.S. military is doing worse than civilian institutions when it comes to the investigation and prosecution of sexual assault cases? And in your view, what are the areas in the military's response to sexual violence that need the most attention and improvement?
Well, this is one of those things that is really impossible to average. There are several civilian jurisdictions that are doing quite good work in both investigating and prosecuting non-stranger sexual assaults, but they're really exceptions. By and large, it's a pretty bad picture. Likewise, in the services, there are some good things that have started to happen in terms of better training, both for investigators and for JAG officers. It may be too soon to see much of the impact of that. I hear a little bit from, I just did a training of Army JAG officers and have begun to hear them say that they are seeing better CID reports. That's encouraging. It's very anecdotal, but if you started hearing that more and more, that would certainly be encouraging. About 3 months ago, I consulted on a court-martial, and it was probably an anomaly in that things went really well. Everything went well. Everybody did their jobs really well. What I value that experience for is it told me that it's possible, that if you have both JAG officers and OSI agents and the judge, the military judge, who are well trained to understand the issues, that this is a process that can be respectful to victims, can be respectful to the rights of the accused, and can handle even the complexities of a non-stranger sexual assault well. And there was a good outcome. There was, from my perspective, there was a conviction and a good sentence. So it's possible. It's still obviously happening rarely. I would hope that if the training that has begun is sustained, that we'll see more of that. I also hope that if you see more of that, that some of what's just been described here is that we will begin to see incremental changes in the level of trust in the system, which would lead, hopefully, to more victims being willing to report.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I'm sorry I missed the first part of your testimony, but Tech Sergeant Norris, I really appreciate what you said, because in many ways you capture this incredible dilemma that we're facing. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to follow up briefly, because I had asked about what we were able to capture really from the MTIs that were spoken to at Lackland. We had an opportunity to speak to several of the whistleblowers, and they were very clear about what they felt should be some key recommendations. And I'm just disappointed, and I wanted to include this in the record, that the response came back about MTIs generally. And I believe that the generals knew. I think that they knew, and I have great respect, but I think that we were talking about whistleblower MTIs, and to our knowledge, they actually have still not been spoken to. And I think the people who were willing to come forward, because this very issue of sort of seeing through the good guys and being able to say, hey, it's not all that it appears.
which is what many of the victims grapple with. I think we are doing a better job training prosecutors, and we've had an opportunity to hear some of that evolution of the way that we do that. But it is still a big problem. I wanted to ask, because I must say, I have been reluctant to take this out of the chain of command, because everything else is in the chain of command. And for us to pull this out in some ways says that we don't believe that our officers are capable of dealing with this issue. So I wanted to just come back and ask, of the testimony that we had, and I often think that it's better to go with this kind of testimony and then follow up, frankly, but what is it that you heard that was helpful, that you think is moving forward well, and what really was problematic? Because what we're interested here is what is the most effective, what will change the culture and change the ability of people to have any trust in it. So if you could respond to that, that would be helpful. And if you want to start.
Yes, ma'am. Are you talking about when I was listening to General Welsh and General Rice?
Yes, if you'd like to respond to that.
I had a very difficult time listening to General Welsh and General Rice today, not only because of my own experience, but also because of what's happening to this day. This morning, I got a call from a client that's in the Air Force that we're having issues with. So it's, despite what General Rice and General Welsh are saying, which could very likely be very genuine, and they really do care, they're basically putting their trust in each individual commander to do the right thing. And in my eyes, that means, okay, Commander, you're judge, jury, and executioner. You make the decisions. And what's happening is our commanders, depending on who they are, and even whether they're even, schooled in this. I mean, it was hard for me to understand the whole thing, and I was a victim of it. But what we're finding is that the commanders aren't always giving people the right information in addition to even dealing with it. So they're not saying, okay, maybe we need to contact OSI and do something about this. They have the ability to stop it right there just by saying a couple things. All it would take is for a commander to say, well, this is alleged, or, well, it's a he said, she said, for a victim to pretty much fall apart and decide, I don't trust you, and I don't trust anybody, and I'm not doing anything with this. Me personally, I'm a spitball. I'm a spitball of fire, and I fought back on every single thing because I knew that in America there's basic constitutional rights that include males and females. We are equal. So why is it that commanders in the military are given this special position that in society we have civilian courts, we have Supreme Courts, we have the ability to appeal, we have all these different options available to us, but in the military we have one person that may or may not help you.
Mm-hmm. If I may go to Dr. Lusak, from your experience as well, looking at this in a beyond the military, what is your sense of this? Again, in terms of pulling that out from the military accountability.
Well, I guess I have to preface what I say with a major caveat, which is I'm not an attorney and I don't view myself as anything close to an expert on the military justice system. So this is purely from my own experience and just anecdotally. I recognize that what's been very articulately posed here is a significant problem. And I think a solution has to be found to that. The services are clearly trying to solve it with training. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know whether in 25 years, if we can wait that long, whether that will work, or whether in 25 years we'll have another hearing like this, you know, and be looking for another solution. I wish I could, because it's clear, you know, even not being an expert, I can tell that this is a major decision to make, and it can have all kinds of repercussions, many of which we can't anticipate, and some of which could be pretty harmful. So it's a serious decision to be made. I guess my only contribution could be that yes, this is a very serious problem, and what was, you know, so described so perfectly, that when you have, you know, we all want victims to come forward. If they don't come forward, not only can we not provide them with the services we want, but we cannot go after those predators. We, you know, the justice system can't work. Nothing works, and yet we haven't earned their trust. And how do you earn their trust when the command structure is in a sense, it's a very incestuous place, and you're asking victims to come forward to somebody who has a tremendous amount of power over them. So how we resolve that, I don't know, and I don't want to pretend that I do, other than you're hearing that this is a serious problem that we have to find some solution for.
I know we have to move on. Did you have a comment? Would you like to, Chief Master Sergeant, did you want to respond to this issue?
Well, I think the first thing we need to look at is a change in culture. I mean, we sent out, one of the things that we did was we had the command-directed look at for inappropriate material in the workplaces. That was directed by the Secretary of the Air Force. What we didn't say was you had notice and commanders ignored you. We found this much mini material, then generals, why did the commanders ignore you? Why? I mean, if you have a good grasp of the culture, then why are they blowing you off? You know, so we need to start at the beginning. I mean, you know, I would have been down at the base removing the commander. If after a month's notice he knew we were coming and they had videos and inappropriate behavior. We're not taking action on the existing issues that we have right now.
Thank you.
Ms. Spear?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Let me say to all of you, I really apologize for the fact that so many of the members had to leave, many of them having to catch planes and the like. I would agree with Congresswoman Davis that it would have been appropriate to have you speak first so that it would have allowed for the generals to recognize what we're talking about here more specifically. To you, retired Sergeant McNally, you're absolutely right. There was an actual notice that went out in the Air Force. We're going to come through. We're going to see whether or not you've got sexual harassing documentation in your cubicle on your computer. Not your, by the way, not your laptops, but just the main servers. And after a month's notice, they collected 32,000 inappropriate documents. So your point is well taken. Mr. Chairman, I want to introduce one other victim who was not one of the, or survivors, I should say, was not one of those who testified. Jessica Henvey is here. Jessica, would you stand up for a moment? Jessica was an airman. She was raped. She reported the rape in 2009. So this is not an old case. This is a recent case. She was told that it was going to be investigated. It was going to go to court-martial. 2 days before it was going to go to the court-martial, a new commander came into town, and that commander has the authority to dismiss the prosecution and ordered the court-martial to be abandoned. That's what's wrong with the system. Certain individuals have power that far exceed what it should be, and if you can basically stop a court-martial after all of that has taken place, you don't have the kind of independence to look at these cases. And that's what's so frustrating to so many of us. Thank you, Jessica. Dr. Lysak, you spoke earlier and talked about your work with the military, and it's been over 10 years. And I got the impression that you were basically saying that, you know, things are looking pretty good. And while, you know, there's probably more work that should be done, it's better than it is in the civilian arena. And so I'd like for you to just comment on that a little more specifically.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I'm sorry I gave you the impression that I think that things are looking pretty good. Anything but. I was comparing the military's performance to the performance in the civilian sector in both the local district attorneys and in our universities, sort of similar populations. And compared to that, the military looks pretty good. But that really is, as much if not more, a comment about how bad things are in the civilian world. I don't disagree with anything that's been said here in terms of the really profound problems that the services have. I do see the services making efforts that I don't see in the civilian world. And I see little bits and pieces of evidence that some of those efforts are bearing fruit, and that gives me some hope.
Okay, let me ask you another question. You've done a lot of research, and you have profiled sexual predators, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Well, I studiously do not use the word profile.
Okay. Well, you've studied them.
Yes.
And you've studied them in the military. And my understanding is that it's not unusual to have these individuals, who I will call sexual predators, be exemplary soldiers. And beyond being exemplary soldiers, being soldiers that also are very good at identifying targets that are ripe for the preying. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. So one of the things that happens in the military is you can have as a mitigating factor the fact that you have good military character. That's a mitigating factor. So we can reduce, even though this is a felony, even though this is a crime, if you've been an exemplary soldier, then we're going to reduce the sentence, because we don't have sentence guidelines in the military either. So I would actually disagree with you on a lot of counts as compared to the civilian society, where we do have sentencing guidelines, where there is a rape shield law, and where there is an appeal process, and where there's independence, none of which exists in the military. But knowing that, don't we have a greater obligation in the military to make sure that these individuals that prey on victims, trainees in this case, over and over again, get taken out? I mean taken out of the military. I don't mean taken out in the...
Well, I certainly agree with you that the only solution, if you have identified a predator and you have some kind of judicial process, that the research is very clear that there's very little that can be done to rehabilitate predators, and that for the protection of the community, whether it's the military or university or the civilian community, these individuals have to be isolated from the community, basically.
All right, thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you. Ms. Duckworth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lisak, the question I have for you is, in dealing in these situations, you know, having been part of an air crew and a tight-knit military unit myself, I find that the unit members know the tendencies of individuals, so that when this person is being accused, it's not surprising. They may be of great, upstanding moral character, and they're great. They're, as we used to say in the Army, they're your high and tight soldiers. They're hard chargers. But you know, because the same situation that gets you into a situation where you are protective of one another and close-knit also puts you in a role where you understand that, okay, I got to watch out for this guy. Is there anything that has been changed by the rise of women into higher ranks? I was often, for example, the highest ranking female in my unit, and I found that it became my role to step in other units as well, and I was often the only EEO officer. So are you seeing some of those dynamics? I'm not saying that there are not great male officers who act the way they should, but does that change the dynamic at all to have more female officers who are trained?
This is a very anecdotal response to that,
okay.
Because it's you know, it's my limited experience with you know, the various services. I think it helps, but I don't think it's something that can be relied on as the fix, because the same sort of cultural dynamics that we've been talking about here all morning, all into the afternoon, apply to women as well. And the forces, the pressures to conform, the pressures not to report, the pressures to be careful about who you say what to, can apply to women as well and can silence women even when they are in authority. When you're in authority in the services, there's always somebody who's got more authority and more power. I think it is it's an improvement and it helps, but it's not a sort of a fundamental fix.
Thank you. Sergeant Norris, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to start by saying that oftentimes this issue gets turned into a male-on-female issue. And it's very important to note that 56% of our victims are males. It is yet to be looked at and given the attention that it needs to. And I want that on the record today, that this is not just a female issue, this is a predator issue. And just to let you know, things are getting worse. In 2010 and 2011, commander actions on the ground dealing with sexual assault complaints have gone down 23%. Down 23%. Court martials, 2010, 2011, down 22%. Court martial convictions, same year, down 8%. The DOD surveys find that 39% of perpetrators are of higher rank, 23% are in their chain of command. So we're asking our people, our troops, to turn to potential predators to report another predator, according to these statistics.
Thank you for that. I did not know you said 56%
yes.
number. That is good to know. So my question to you then, Sergeant Norris, you obviously are, as you said, a Spitfire and are willing to stand up. Do you find many of your clients choosing to stay in once they are given the tools? Are any of them, is there any way, once they've gone through this process, and if there is a resolution that can be reached, is there any way to keep these amazing men and women that we've invested so much money into, so much effort into, who could then take this knowledge and help others as they go on in their career? Or are they so hurt that they just don't want nothing to do with the military?
That's a great question. On paper, all the sexual assault policies in the military, they're so pretty. They're beautiful. If they actually were implemented, that would be great, but they are not. And we see it to this day. Since the passage of the Defense Strong Act in 2011, we have been dealing with implementation issues the entire time because of people just straight up ignoring it, not wanting to deal with it, or just, we don't have time for this, the mission's more important, beat it. That's what we're seeing. The culture is getting more vicious. I don't know if it's because it's become so popular with Congress now and that it's out in the media, but the stakes have been risen. So in addition to getting raped, you're getting beat, you're getting threatened, and then we're having to fight with commanders on how to get this person off that base so they won't get prolonged PTSD. So no, right now, we're not going to be able to save them, not with the system we have in place right now.
Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. I just wanted to thank both Sergeant McNally and Sergeant Norris for your courage and leadership. We sure need a lot more like you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Likewise, again, we want to thank you for taking time to be here this afternoon, and certainly to you, Tech Sergeant, for sharing your very compelling story, and for other witnesses for providing your expertise to the panel. Seeing no other questions, the meeting is adjourned.
good day.
You too.
See you then.
Mr. Blunt.
You see a tweet there from Pete Sessions saying that the House just passed the No Budget, No Pay Act. The House a short time ago passed the debt limit bill. The vote was 285 to 144. The Hill writes that the Senate will immediately pass the bill to extend the debt limit to May 19th on condition that both chambers pass budget resolutions by mid-April. The story goes on to say that Senate Democratic leaders proclaimed victory in the long-running battle over the debt ceiling and described House Republicans as being in, quote, full-on retreat on fiscal policy. The Democrats touted victory on two fronts. They claimed Republicans have agreed to raise the debt limit without threatening to force a partial government shutdown or default, and to break the Boehner rule, named after Speaker John Boehner, which calls for spending cuts to match increases in the debt limit dollar for dollar.